I should have known the phone call wasn't going to be anything good the second I saw Emily's name flash across my screen, because she never reached out unless she wanted something, and even then, it was always framed like she was doing me some kind of favor by letting me be part of her life. I almost let it go to voicemail, almost ignored it entirely, but some sick, twisted part of me was curious about what she could possibly want now, considering we hadn't spoken in months, maybe even a full year, and the last time we did. It was because she was trying to stir up drama at Thanksgiving over something completely ridiculous. With a sigh, I finally answered, already bracing myself for whatever nonsense was about to spill from her mouth, and sure enough, the moment I said hello, she let out an exaggerated, dramatic gasp, as if she couldn't believe I had deigned to pick up the phone for my dear stepsister. For the first few minutes, she laid it on thick, gushing about how much she missed me, how we really needed to reconnect, how she hated that we weren't closer, as if she hadn't spent the last decade treating me like an afterthought whenever I wasn't useful to her. She went on about her recent engagement, detailing how magical it was, how perfect her fiancé was, how it felt like a fairy tale, and I could practically hear the self-satisfaction dripping from every word, as if she was expecting me to burst into applause for her achievement of convincing some poor guy to marry her. I nodded along, making polite noises where necessary, waiting for the inevitable moment when she would drop the act and get to the real reason she had called, because Emily never wasted this much energy on pleasantries unless there was something in it for her. Then, just as I was about to ask what she actually wanted, she sighed dramatically and said, "So listen, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I really think it makes the most sense for you to pay for my wedding, considering, you make so much more money than me." For a moment, I actually thought I had misheard her, that maybe I had finally lost my mind, that maybe my ears were playing tricks on me, because there was no way she had just demanded I fund her wedding as if it was the most reasonable request in the world. I stayed silent for a few seconds, letting her words settle, trying to process the sheer entitlement radiating through the phone, before finally letting out a short, disbelieving laugh and asking if she was actually being serious. Emily didn't even hesitate before launching into an entire speech about how weddings were expensive, how she and her fiancé were struggling to cover all the costs, how she wanted the perfect day but just didn't have the budget to make it happen, and how I, being her older and more financially successful sister, should want to help her out because, after all, wasn't that what family was for? She kept talking, listing all the reasons why it made sense for me to foot the bill, acting as if she was doing me a favor by even asking, as if I should feel honored to be part of her special day in such a meaningful way. I cut her off mid-sentence, my voice sharp and firm, telling her in no uncertain terms that I wasn't going to pay a dime for her wedding and that she was completely out of line for even suggesting it. There was a beat of silence, just long enough for me to think she might actually process what I was saying, but then she let out a dramatic, wounded sigh, the kind she always used when she wanted to play the victim, and she muttered something about how she should have known I wouldn't care enough to help her.
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Before I could even get another word in, she hung up on me, and I stared at my phone in absolute disbelief, my mind still struggling to catch up with the absurdity of what had just happened. I should have known she wasn't going to let it go, should have realized that this was just the beginning, because less than an hour later, my mother was calling, her name flashing across my screen like a warning siren. And I debated whether I had the energy to deal with whatever storm Emily had just sent my way. Against my better judgment, I answered, and before I could even say hello, my mother was already launching into a full-blown lecture, her voice dripping with disappointment as she told me she couldn't believe how selfish I was being, how heartless it was of me to refuse to help my own stepsister on the most important day of her life. She went on and on, parroting Emily's ridiculous arguments, talking about how family was supposed to support each other, how I was lucky to be in a position to help, how it wouldn't even be a big deal for me to cover the wedding since I had plenty of money, and how she didn't understand why I was being so stubborn. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the money, that it was about the sheer entitlement of the request, that it was completely unreasonable for Emily to expect me to fund her wedding just because I happened to be more financially stable than her. But my mother wasn't listening, wasn't hearing a single word I was saying, because in her mind, Emily had already spun the perfect sob story, had already positioned herself as the poor, struggling victim, had already made it seem like I was the villain in all of this. Then, just when I thought she couldn't possibly make me any angrier, she sighed heavily, her voice dropping into that disappointed, condescending tone she always used when she wanted to make me feel guilty, and she said, "Rachel, do you really want to be the reason your sister's wedding is ruined?" Something inside me snapped at that moment, something deep and unmovable, something that had been waiting years to finally break free, and I felt a cold, calculating calm settle over me as I realized exactly what needed to happen next. They wanted me to be involved in the wedding so badly? Fine. I'd give them a wedding gift they'd never forget. The flood of messages started almost immediately after I hung up with my mother, each notification flashing across my screen like a slow-moving car crash I couldn't look away from, each one filled with varying degrees of disappointment, passive aggression, or outright hostility. My aunts, my cousins, distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, even family friends who had no business being involved, all of them suddenly had something to say about what a selfish, cold-hearted person I had become. The first few messages were almost laughable in their absurdity, filled with thinly veiled attempts to guilt me into giving in, carefully worded reminders that family takes care of family and this is what good sisters do for each other. But as the day dragged on and the texts kept coming, the tone started to shift, the subtle manipulations giving way to outright anger, the accusations getting bolder, the insults getting nastier. My cousin Laura, who I hadn't seen in over 5 years and who had never once reached out to me for any reason before now, sent me a long-winded, condescending message about how Emily looked up to me her whole life and how devastating it must be for her to realize that I don't care about her happiness at all. My Aunt Karen, who had spent the better part of my childhood making snide remarks about my weight and grades, informed me that money had clearly made me arrogant and that I needed to humble myself before I lost the people who actually loved me. Even my grandmother, sweet and well-meaning but easily influenced, left me a teary voicemail about how she just wanted the family to come together and didn't understand why I was being so cruel. Through it all, my mother remained the loudest voice, her messages growing more dramatic with each passing hour, her frustration dripping from every word as she tried to break me down in the same ways she always had when I was younger. She sent paragraph after paragraph about how I was turning my back on my own sister, how she didn't raise me to be so selfish, how it was so disappointing to see what kind of person I had become. When guilt didn't work, she shifted tactics, reminding me in excruciating detail about everything she had done for me growing up, as if the mere act of parenting was some kind of loan I had yet to repay. She listed off every sacrifice she had ever made, every meal she had cooked, every ride she had given me to school, every scraped knee she had patched up. As if those things weren't just basic responsibilities, but rather debts that I now owed her in the form of a wedding check. By the time the 4th or 5th hour of this nonsense rolled around, I was no longer feeling even a shred of anger, just a cold, detached sort of amusement at how completely ridiculous they all sounded. They weren't actually upset about the wedding itself, not really, because this had never been about celebrating love or making Emily's dream day come true. No, this was about control, about forcing me into the role they had written for me a long time ago, the one where I was supposed to be the reliable one, the responsible one, the one who always picked up the pieces, the one who never said no, the one who existed solely to make life easier for everyone else. The real kicker came when I finally scrolled through one particularly long message from a friend of Emily's, someone I barely knew, someone who clearly had no idea that I had been on this planet long before Emily had ever come into the picture. This woman, who I could only assume had been fed a very specific, very dramatic version of the story, informed me that Emily was devastated by my refusal, that she had been crying for hours, that she just couldn't understand why I was being so heartless. But the part that made me pause, the part that made me reread the message twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining things, was the casual little sentence thrown in near the end. She told us you've always been jealous of her happiness, and honestly, it makes sense now. I stared at the words, the audacity of it hitting me like a slap, my fingers tightening around the phone as something dark and razor-sharp curled in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Jealous. She had actually told people that I was jealous of her, that the reason I wouldn't pay for her wedding wasn't because it was a completely unreasonable demand, but because I simply couldn't stand to see her happy. It wasn't enough that she had tried to manipulate me into handing over my hard-earned money. No, she had to make sure that when I refused, everyone saw me as the villain, that I was the bitter, miserable stepsister who just wanted to ruin her perfect life. I let out a slow breath, my pulse steady, my anger cooling into something far more dangerous than rage. Fine. If she wanted to paint me as the villain, I would show her exactly what that looked like. I wasn't going to argue with them anymore, wasn't going to waste my breath trying to reason with people who had already made up their minds. I wasn't going to keep explaining myself to people who had never once considered whether I had feelings, whether I was being treated unfairly, whether I even wanted to be part of this ridiculous circus in the first place. No, I was done playing their game, done sitting back and letting them twist the story into whatever version made them feel comfortable. I was going to make sure Emily got exactly what she deserved, and I was going to do it in a way that none of them would ever see coming. The message came late at night, long after I had turned my phone on silent and decided that I had wasted more than enough energy on this ridiculous situation, but when I saw Emily's name pop up on my screen, I already knew it wasn't going to be anything good. I debated ignoring it, letting it sit there unread just to remind her that I wasn't going to be dragged into her endless demands, but curiosity got the best of me, and before I could talk myself out of it, I opened the message and scrolled through the absurdly long wall of text she had sent. It was a detailed breakdown of her wedding expenses, complete with itemized costs, specific deposit amounts, and a grand total that made my stomach twist with disbelief at the sheer audacity of it all. She had listed every single thing she expected me to pay for, from the overpriced venue she had chosen without consulting me, to the designer dress that cost more than some people's cars, to the full open bar that was apparently a necessity because she wanted her guests to have the best experience possible. She had even thrown in a honeymoon fund, as if it wasn't enough for me to be financing the wedding itself. Apparently, she also thought I should be paying for her romantic getaway with a man I barely knew, a man who, as far as I could tell, had no idea just how manipulative she really was. I sat there for a long time, staring at the message, feeling my heartbeat slow to something cold and steady, feeling the last traces of patience I had been clinging to finally snap under the weight of it all. This wasn't just a request anymore. This was a demand, an expectation, a blatant declaration that she had decided it was my responsibility to make sure her wedding happened exactly the way she wanted, without a single thought about how unfair or unreasonable that was. She wasn't even asking at this point. She was handing me a bill and assuming I would pay it without question, assuming I would just accept my role as the eternal doormat she and my mother had always treated me as. I snapped. I typed my response without hesitation, my fingers moving faster than my mind, my anger sharpening into something dangerously clear as I laid out exactly where I stood. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that I was done with the manipulation, done with the guilt trips, done with the endless cycle of giving and giving while she took without a second thought. I told her that she had two choices. She could either stop treating me like a walking ATM, stop expecting free handouts, stop acting like the world owed her something just because she wanted it, or she could accept that I was cutting contact for good. Her response came within seconds, a single, hollow laugh followed by a smug, dismissive message. Mom will take care of it. You'll never actually turn your back on family, and we both know it. I read the message twice, letting the weight of it settle, feeling the full impact of what she had just admitted without even realizing it. She wasn't worried. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't even remotely concerned about the fact that I had just threatened to cut her off completely. She didn't believe me because she had never seen me walk away before, never seen me hold my ground, never seen me do anything but cave under the weight of our mother's constant pressure. She had already decided that I would break, that I would come crawling back, that I would do exactly what I had always done, sacrifice my own boundaries for the sake of keeping the peace. And that was the moment I realized just how long they had been using me. It wasn't just this wedding. It wasn't just this one demand. It wasn't just a single instance of entitlement and manipulation. It was a pattern, a lifetime of being expected to give without question, to step up when no one else would, to take responsibility for things that were never mine to begin with. My mother had done it for years, twisting reality every time I tried to push back, making me believe that being a good daughter meant being selfless to the point of exhaustion. And Emily had learned from the best, had watched and studied, had perfected the art of making me feel like the bad guy every time I said no. And for so many years, I had let them do it. I had let them guilt me, let them control me, let them twist my love into something they could weaponize against me. But standing there, staring at that message, feeling the weight of their manipulation finally fall into place, I realized something that should have been obvious a long time ago. They didn't actually love me. Not in the way love was supposed to mean, not in the way family was supposed to work, not in the way that cared about me as a person instead of as a resource. And if they didn't love me, if they had never loved me in a way that wasn't transactional, then what the hell was I still doing pretending that I owed them anything? I closed the messages, took a deep breath, and felt something in me shift, something that had been buried under years of obligation finally start to break free. Fine. If Emily wanted me to be the villain, if she wanted to paint me as the jealous, bitter stepsister who just wanted to ruin her wedding, then I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. But it wouldn't be in the way she expected. No, this wasn't going to be some petty argument, some screaming match over text, some half-hearted attempt to make her see reason. This was going to be a lesson she would never forget. The decision settled in my mind like a quiet storm, steady and inevitable, a shift so final that I no longer felt anger, no longer felt frustration, no longer felt anything but an eerie kind of calm that came with knowing exactly what had to be done. I had spent years being the one who bent first, the one who swallowed her pride, the one who let things go for the sake of peace, but now, standing at the edge of this moment, I knew with absolute certainty that Emily and my mother were about to learn something they should have understood a long time ago. I wasn't their puppet, I wasn't their bank, and I sure as hell wasn't someone they could push around anymore. So I did what they least expected. I called Emily. I let my voice shake just enough to sound hesitant, let my breath catch in my throat as though I had been struggling with this decision, let just the right amount of guilt drip into my words as I told her that I had thought it over and realized that maybe, just maybe, she was right. I told her I didn't want to be the reason her wedding was ruined, didn't want to be the selfish sister who let money come between family, didn't want to look back years from now and regret not doing the right thing. I told her that, while I still couldn't cover the entire wedding, I wanted to contribute something special, something that would make her big day unforgettable, a surprise that would ensure she had a moment that people would talk about for years. The second the words left my mouth, I could hear the self-satisfaction seeping into her voice, could almost picture the smug little smile curling across her lips, could feel the sheer triumph radiating through the phone as she all but purred, "I knew you'd come around." She didn't thank me, didn't ask what had changed my mind, didn't so much as acknowledge the weeks of insults and manipulation she had thrown at me, because, in her mind, this had been inevitable. She had expected me to break, had known all along that I wouldn't be able to stand firm, had always assumed that I would fold under the pressure and do exactly what I was told. And that was the mistake that was going to cost her everything. Within an hour, word had already spread through the family, the same relatives who had been berating me just days before now suddenly finding the time to message me, each one dripping with fake warmth and thinly veiled condescension as they told me how proud they were that I had finally done the right thing. My mother called me almost immediately, her voice practically vibrating with relief as she gushed about how happy Emily was, how important this was, how good it felt to see the family coming together. She didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the emotional warfare she had waged against me, didn't even hesitate before slipping right back into the role of the gracious mother who always knew I would make the right choice. Emily, meanwhile, wasted absolutely no time making sure everyone knew exactly what had happened, posting about it on social media, sending out little messages to mutual friends, casually dropping into conversation that Rachel finally got over herself and decided to step up. It wasn't enough that she had won, she needed everyone to see that she had won, needed everyone to know that she had once again gotten exactly what she wanted. And I let her believe it. I let her run her mouth, let her brag to anyone who would listen, let her gloat over the fact that she had once again manipulated her way into getting what she wanted, because every word she spoke, every post she made, every single person she pulled into her little victory lap was just another witness to what was about to happen next. I wasn't just going to ruin her wedding. I was going to make sure she never forgot it. The wedding venue was everything Emily had ever wanted, a grand and extravagant display of excess, a towering testament to her own vanity, with massive floral arrangements lining the aisles, crystal chandeliers glistening from the ceiling, and an open bar that promised an endless flow of expensive champagne for the dozens of guests who had come to witness her perfect day. I arrived precisely on time, dressed in a sleek, elegant gown, my expression composed, my demeanor warm, my smile practiced to perfection, ensuring that not a single person in the room could suspect what was about to unfold. Emily spotted me almost immediately, her face lighting up with the kind of self-satisfied glow that only came from knowing she had won, from believing that she had successfully bent me to her will, from feeling completely and utterly in control of everything and everyone around her. She strutted toward me with a confidence that was nearly unbearable to watch, her pristine white gown trailing behind her, her entire posture dripping with triumph, as if she was some magnanimous queen granting me an audience in her royal court. "Oh my God, Rachel, you actually showed up," she gushed, her voice artificially sweet, her eyes gleaming with barely concealed amusement as she pulled me into a stiff, rehearsed hug before stepping back to appraise me like some rare artifact she had decided to tolerate for the evening. I have to say, I was a little worried there for a minute, but you really came through for me in the end, didn't you? I tilted my head slightly, my smile never faltering, my voice light and pleasant, my heart steady as I responded with a simple, knowing, of course, "Emily, anything for you." She beamed at me, completely oblivious, completely unaware, completely wrapped up in her own false sense of victory, before turning to the gathered guests and raising her champagne glass with theatrical flair, her voice carrying over the crowd as she made sure everyone in the room could hear exactly what she was about to say. I just want to take a moment to give a huge, heartfelt thank you to my amazing stepsister Rachel, who went above and beyond to help make today as special as it is, she announced, pausing for dramatic effect, soaking in the attention, waiting for the inevitable wave of murmurs and nods of approval from the surrounding crowd. She has been so incredibly generous, and I honestly don't know what I would have done without her support, so let's all raise a glass to Rachel for finally stepping up and doing the right thing. The room erupted into polite applause, glasses clinking together, guests smiling in my direction, oblivious to the way my fingers curled just slightly around the stem of my own glass, my grip tightening for just a fraction of a second before I forced myself to remain perfectly composed. I let her have her moment, let her bask in the attention, let her enjoy the last few seconds of her own delusion before I took a small step forward, my smile widening just a bit as I raised my own glass and spoke in a voice that was impossibly calm, impossibly even, impossibly steady. "Well, since we're all here, and since Emily has so graciously called attention to my generosity, I figured now would be the perfect time to finally reveal my special wedding gift for the happy couple," I said, watching as her expression flickered ever so slightly, as a tiny crease of confusion formed between her brows as she shifted uneasily despite the confidence she had been radiating just moments ago. I turned slightly, nodding toward the two men standing near the entrance, both dressed in crisp suits, both carrying identical black folders tucked under their arms, both moving forward with the kind of slow, deliberate pace that drew the attention of every single person in the room. "This," I continued smoothly, reaching out to accept one of the folders before carefully flipping it open, "is a very special financial breakdown I had put together for the occasion. A little something I thought Emily and her new husband might appreciate now that they're officially starting their lives together. A hush fell over the room, the polite wedding chatter dying instantly, the shift in atmosphere immediate and impossible to ignore, as Emily's smile faltered into something closer to panic, as her hands twitched slightly against the folds of her expensive dress, as she realized, far too late, that she had made a terrible mistake. I thought it would be important for everyone here to know just how much love and effort went into planning this beautiful day. I continued, my tone still light, still sweet, still laced with just enough amusement to make Emily's face drain of all color. To make her new husband shift uneasily beside her, to make my mother finally begin to understand that something was very, very wrong. With deliberate, calculated movements, I lifted the first page of the document, angling it just enough so that several guests in the front row could clearly see what was written in bold letters across the top. A list of Emily's unpaid debts. Credit card bills, overdue loan payments, extravagant purchases made on borrowed money, reckless spending disguised as necessities, each one carefully documented, each one painstakingly outlined in black and white. Each one a glaring testament to the financial disaster that Emily had so carefully hidden from everyone, especially her soon-to-be husband. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the crowd, eyes widening, heads turning, uncomfortable glances being exchanged as Emily let out a strangled noise that was somewhere between a gasp and a choked-off scream. Her carefully crafted composure shattering in an instant as she lunged toward me with pure, unfiltered panic written across her face. "What the hell is this?" she hissed, her voice shaking, her hands trembling, her entire body radiating disbelief, rage, and something that looked an awful lot like fear. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the silence stretch just long enough to savor the moment, before setting my glass down with an almost lazy kind of grace and tilting my head at her with a mocking smile that I knew would haunt her forever. "Oh, Emily," I murmured, watching as her world collapsed around her in real time, watching as her new husband turned toward her with a face that could only be described as horrified realization, watching as the family who had so blindly defended her suddenly found themselves unable to meet her eyes. "I told you I'd make your wedding unforgettable." The silence that followed my words was unlike anything I had ever experienced before, stretching out in a way that felt almost surreal, as if the entire room had been sucked into a vacuum where time itself had slowed. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emily had nothing to say, no snide remarks, no fake laughter, no dramatic monologues about how I had wronged her. Nothing but the wide-eyed horror of a woman who had just realized her world was crumbling right in front of her. Her mouth opened and closed, her breath shallow, her fingers twitching as she struggled to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what I had just done. But before she could even begin to form a response, I reached into the folder again, flipping to the next page. My voice smooth and unwavering as I continued my carefully orchestrated demolition of her perfect day. "Now, I know weddings are expensive," I said, my tone light, conversational, almost as if I was simply making an innocent observation, and I truly admire the effort Emily has put into making sure this day was as extravagant as possible. I turned slightly, making eye contact with her fiancé, who was already looking at her with a mixture of growing unease and barely concealed suspicion, his expression darkening as he took in the papers in my hand. "But what I find really fascinating," I continued, "is the fact that Emily never actually planned to pay for any of it herself. In fact, she and my dear mother have been working very hard behind the scenes to make sure I ended up covering a lot more than I was even aware of." I slowly lifted the next page, revealing a string of financial transactions, each one carefully highlighted, each one a direct attempt to shift additional wedding expenses onto my accounts without my knowledge. Each one a blatant act of fraud that Emily had orchestrated under the assumption that I'd never bother to check. The whispers in the room grew louder, the tension thickening like a noose tightening around her throat, and I could practically hear the blood drain from her face as she stared at the evidence in stunned disbelief. "No, no, "This isn't real," she finally stammered, her voice rising in pitch, her hands shaking as she reached for the papers like she could somehow make them disappear just by touching them, her entire body radiating the pure, desperate panic of someone who had just realized they were drowning with no way to swim to the surface. "Oh, it's very real," I said smoothly, pulling back before she could snatch the documents away, my grip firm as I held them high enough for the people around us to clearly see, ensuring that there was no possible way for her to spin this into anything other than what it was, undeniable proof of her own greed and deceit. "And just in case anyone here still thinks I'm exaggerating," I continued, "I have a little bonus feature for today's festivities." With deliberate precision, I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen a few times before turning up the volume, letting the unmistakable sound of Emily's own voice fill the room. Crisp and clear and dripping with the very arrogance that had led her to believe she could get away with all of this without consequence. "Rachel's so stupid, honestly. She'll cave in the end like she always does. It's literally hilarious watching her try to act like she has a backbone, but whatever, she's rich, so it's not like she actually needs the money. She should just be grateful she even gets to be part of my wedding at all." The words hit the air like a grenade exploding in the middle of the reception, a collective gasp rippling through the crowd, a sharp, jagged noise that sent a violent shudder of realization through Emily's fiancé, whose face had gone completely blank, completely unreadable, completely void of anything but sheer, icy disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered, his voice tight, his hands clenched into fists, his entire body radiating the kind of barely contained fury that only came from realizing you had been made a complete fool of in front of an entire room full of people. He turned to Emily, his eyes flashing as he shook his head in disgust, his voice low and controlled, but etched with something that sounded dangerously close to complete revulsion. "Is this really who you are?" Emily let out a hysterical, choked noise, her entire demeanor shifting so violently that she barely looked like the same person anymore, her carefully crafted bride-to-be mask shattering under the weight of her own downfall as she grabbed his hands, clutching at him with the kind of desperation that reeked of someone trying to hold on to the last thread of their rapidly unraveling life. "Baby, no. You know she's twisting things," she gasped, her voice trembling, her eyes darting wildly as if looking for an escape route, as if searching for someone, anyone, to back her up, but the room was dead silent. Every single person watching the spectacle unfold with rapt attention, no one willing to come to her rescue. I simply tilted my head, my smile slow and unbothered, my voice deceptively gentle as I delivered the final, killing blow. "Tell me, Emily," I said, my gaze steady, my tone laced with something sharp and unforgiving. "Was it worth it?" The words landed with the force of a wrecking ball, sending her stumbling back like she had been physically struck, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, her mind clearly scrambling for any way to salvage the mess she had created. But there was nothing left to salvage, no story left to spin, no lies left to tell, because for the first time in her life, the truth was standing right in front of her, too loud, too undeniable, too final to be ignored. The guests stood frozen, too stunned to move, too awkward to intervene, too entertained to leave, as Emily's fiancé took one last, lingering look at the woman he had almost married, his lips pressing into a thin, hard line before he finally took a step back, his expression a mask of cold indifference as he turned to me instead. "Thanks for the heads up," he said simply, nodding once, his voice devoid of anything but exhausted resignation, and with that he walked away, leaving Emily standing there, alone, humiliated, and completely, utterly destroyed. I walked out of that wedding reception with my head held high, my heels clicking against the polished floor, my heartbeat steady, my expression unreadable, the echo of Emily's frantic sobs still ringing behind me as I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The weight that had been sitting on my chest for years, the invisible pressure of constantly being expected to give, to bend, to sacrifice, to endure, had finally lifted in a way that felt almost surreal, Like I had spent my entire life carrying something too heavy only to realize, in one swift moment, that I never had to bear it at all. The night air was crisp against my skin as I took a slow, deep breath, my fingers unclenching for the first time in what felt like hours, my body relaxing in a way I hadn't even realized was possible, my mind slowly registering the fact that it was done, that I had actually followed through, that there was no going back now. Emily's perfect little fantasy had shattered in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress. Her dream wedding turned into a slow-moving disaster that she would never be able to rewrite or explain away, her own words laid bare for all to see. The carefully constructed version of herself she had spent years curating torn apart in an instant, exposed for the fraud that it had always been. I should have felt nothing but satisfaction. I should have felt victorious, should have reveled in the knowledge that for the first time in my life, I had taken control of my own narrative, had refused to let them use me, had shown them all that I wasn't the pushover they had always assumed I was. But as I stood there outside the venue, listening to the muffled chaos unfolding behind closed doors, feeling the distant weight of judgment pressing in from every angle, a small, nagging voice in the back of my head whispered a question that I couldn't quite ignore. Did I go too far? The messages started pouring in almost immediately, my phone vibrating relentlessly in my purse, the sharp, repetitive buzz serving as a constant reminder that while I had left the building, the consequences of what I had done were far from over. Some of the messages were short, curt, filled with nothing but stunned silence or vague, uncomfortable attempts at neutrality. Others were furious, long-winded paragraphs from distant relatives who had always sided with my mother, accusing me of ruining a day that wasn't mine to ruin, demanding to know what kind of person could be so cruel, so vindictive, so heartless. But then, mixed in with the outrage, buried beneath the hostility, were the other messages, the quiet, hesitant ones, the ones from family members who had never spoken up before, the ones who had always watched but never intervened. The ones who had spent years biting their tongues because standing against my mother and Emily had never seemed worth the trouble. You did the right thing. I wish I had your courage. She had it coming. I sat there in my car, staring at the screen, scrolling through the words that both condemned and justified everything I had done, feeling the weight of a lifetime of manipulation slowly begin to untangle itself from my shoulders, feeling something close to freedom settle in my chest, heavy but not suffocating, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Then came the final call. My mother. I let the phone ring 3 times before I answered, my voice steady, my expression blank, my entire body bracing for the inevitable explosion that I knew was coming, because there was no reality in which she wouldn't blame me for everything that had happened. What the hell is wrong with you? She spat, her voice sharp, raw with rage, thick with the kind of disappointment that had always been her favorite weapon, as if she thought she could still cut me down, as if she still believed she had power over me. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any idea how badly you've embarrassed this family? I hope you're happy, Rachel, because you just destroyed your relationship with your sister, and for what? Some childish need to prove a point. I took a slow breath, felt the final thread of guilt snap inside me, let her words settle for exactly 3 seconds before I answered. There was never a relationship to destroy, I said simply, my tone devoid of emotion, my resolve finally, completely unshakable. She sucked in a sharp breath, stunned silent for the first time in as long as I could remember, but I didn't give her the chance to recover, didn't let her find a way to twist this back onto me, didn't allow her to rewrite history one last time. I'm done, I said, the words calm, final, so terrifyingly easy to say now that I had finally accepted the truth. I'm done being your scapegoat, done being Emily's safety net, done being the person you both manipulate whenever you want something. You can call me selfish, call me heartless, call me whatever you want, I don't care anymore. She was seething, barely able to contain her fury, grasping for any last bit of control, any last chance to break me down one final time, but she must have realized, in that moment, that she had lost, because her voice dropped into something cold, something filled with the kind of venom that only a mother scorned could produce. You're not my daughter anymore, she hissed, The words slicing through the air, meant to wound, meant to leave a scar, meant to be the final nail in the coffin she had built for me the moment she decided that Emily was worth more than I was. And yet, as I sat there, as I listened to the one person who should have loved me unconditionally disown me over the phone without a moment's hesitation, I felt nothing but relief. "Goodbye, Mom," I said softly, before ending the call, turning off my phone and staring out at the road ahead of me. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, trying to be enough, trying to make them see me as more than just a source of convenience, but the truth had always been painfully simple: they were never going to change. And I had wasted too many years waiting for them to become the kind of family I deserved. For the first time in my life, I was free. But as I sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, mind finally quiet in a way I had never known before, I found myself wondering about the question I knew some people would be asking, the question that would linger long after the dust had settled, the question that had no easy answer. Would you have done the same? Or did I take it too far?